He was still breathing when they placed the rats on his chest. That's the part that won't leave my mind. Not the crowd jeering, not the chains scraping the stone floor, but the sound of his breath, short, fast, like he was trying to disappear inside his own body, as they lowered the metal pot onto him and began heating the bottom with fire. They said his name was Elias. A man in his early 30s, black hair long from neglect, wrists swollen from iron cuffs. His eyes didn't look at anyone. Not even when the bailiff read the charges. Stealing grain. And lying about it. That's all. Not even enough to fill a bucket, they said. His neighbor had caught him reaching over the wall into her granary in the middle of the night. She screamed, others came running, and now, 3 days later, he stood in the center of the town square, chained to the flat punishment stone. I remember the air that morning. Cold, but sharp. The kind that smells like iron and wet leaves. A man nearby sold boiled eggs from a wooden cart, and children were still laughing, chasing each other behind the church. It felt normal. But everyone had come to see the punishment. I hadn't planned to be there. I was only passing through, heading south with a letter for the bishop's clerk. I had stopped at the inn to rest the horse, just for the night. But the innkeeper told me, with strange enthusiasm, that something was happening in the square. Real justice, he said. Not that soft-handed stuff from the king's men. So I went. I wish I hadn't. They'd brought out the sheriff. An old man was shaking hands, flanked by 2 men from the guild who held the tools. I had never seen the device before, just heard about it, whispered by travelers near fires. A kind of iron helmet they placed over the stomach, with rats trapped inside. When heated, the creatures tried to escape. And the only way out was through. I saw the pot before I saw Elias. It looked simple. Dented, blackened from previous use. And inside, 2 rats scurried nervously, sensing movement, scratching against the curved bottom. They were just animals. Small, gray, twitching, the kind you might see in a barn or cellar. Harmless in another life. But nothing felt harmless about what was happening. The crowd pressed closer. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Women stood with arms folded, not speaking. And Elias, he just stood there, as if already gone, while the bailiff tied him flat and unbuttoned his shirt, exposing his ribs. Thin. Bruised. Bruises older than today. One of the men placed the pot onto his bare chest, fastening leather straps across his arms to hold it in place. He didn't move. Not a word, not a flinch. Just that breath, fast, terrified, like he was trying not to be real. And then someone brought the coals. I looked away for just a second. 1 second. Long enough to see the crowd lean forward in unison, their faces pulled tight with a mixture of horror and something else. Something worse. Curiosity. The coals hissed as they were dropped into the small metal tray beneath the pot. It was quiet at first. The kind of quiet where every sound becomes sharper. The soft clink of metal, the creak of leather straps, the slow breath of a man trying not to cry out. The crowd wasn't cheering anymore. Something had shifted. Even the children had gone still, unsure of what they were witnessing. Then the rats began to move. At first, just a rustle. A scratching sound, like dry branches against wood. Elias tensed, the muscles in his arms pulling tight against the restraints. His eyes were open now, wide and unfocused, staring straight up at the gray sky like he was waiting for something to come down and take him away. The pot rattled. You could see it, the jerky, sudden jolts as the rats began to panic. Inside, the heat grew steadily, radiating through the iron into the air. Steam began to rise. Elias's chest lifted in shallow bursts. Then he screamed. It wasn't loud. Not like I'd imagined. It was sharp, a single breath caught halfway between pain and disbelief. Like he hadn't expected it to hurt that way. Like he thought, maybe, he could survive it if he just stayed still. But pain doesn't bargain. The pod jumped again. And again. The straps creaked. One of the men crouched down to adjust the coals, feeding them slowly, patiently, as though cooking a meal. And all the while, Elias screamed in these short, choked bursts. Not long enough to echo. Just enough to stay in your chest after they stopped. I saw someone in the crowd whisper a prayer. A woman, I think, fingers shaking near her mouth, eyes locked on the pot. Another man stepped back, as if realizing too late what he had come to see. But no one left. We were all frozen. Not by fear, but by shame. And still the pot moved. The surface grew darker with soot, the edges glowing faintly red. A sound like boiling water came next, fast, slapping scratches, desperate movement from within. The straps twitched, and Elias began to shake, not violently, but subtly, like something inside him was trying to get out. It went on like that for longer than it should have. Minutes, maybe. Or maybe only seconds. Time feels different when you don't know where to look. Eventually, the sheriff raised his hand. The man with the coals stepped back. The heat had done enough. Someone unstrapped the pot. There was no cheer. No applause. Just a thin silence as they lifted it away and carried it to the edge of the square. What remained? I won't describe. I turned away. Everyone did. The smell hung in the air long after the pot was gone. It was sharp, metallic, mixed with smoke and something else. Something sour and warm and too real. The kind of smell that makes you stop breathing without realizing it, just so you won't take it in. Elias wasn't moving. They untied his arms. Loosened the leather. One of the guild men took a damp cloth and wiped his face like it made a difference. But Elias's eyes weren't looking at the sky anymore. They weren't looking anywhere. Someone draped a wool blanket over his chest. It was a strange gesture, like trying to shield him from shame, when what he needed shielding from had already passed. The crowd started to thin. Slowly. Awkwardly. It was like everyone had been holding a breath and didn't know what to do with it now. People murmured as they left, talking in low tones, trying to soften what they'd just seen by putting it into words. But the words didn't work. No one said much. No one made jokes. Just footsteps, fading, like rain after thunder. I stayed. I don't know why. The square was almost empty by the time I stepped forward. One of the guards glanced at me, said nothing. I knelt down, not close, just near enough to see Elias's face. His skin was damp, pale, his jaw tight. And then he blinked. It wasn't fast. Just one slow movement, like someone surfacing from deep water. His lips moved a little, too. No sound came out, but it was enough to freeze me in place. He was still there. Still in that body. Still tethered to whatever pain hadn't yet passed through. I looked up at the guard. "He needs a surgeon," I said. The guard shook his head. "He'll live." And that was it. They lifted him, roughly, like lifting a sack of grain, and carried him toward the jailhouse, feet dragging behind, face turned sideways into the crook of one man's shoulder. The blanket slipped, trailing behind in the dirt. I watched until the door closed behind them. That night, I couldn't sleep. The inn was quiet. The fire had burned down to orange dust. Upstairs, someone was snoring behind a thin wall. But in my room, everything felt too loud. The wind through the shutter. The creak of the wooden floor. My own heartbeat, pressing against the silence. I kept seeing Elias's eyes. That slow blink. The way his mouth had moved, like he was trying to say something to no one in particular. Not even for help. Just to not vanish. I'd seen pain before. Blisters on soldiers, infections in field camps, broken bones after cart accidents. But this was something else. This wasn't just pain. It was designed. It had a purpose. The next morning, I didn't leave. The horse was saddled. My letter was still sealed in my bag. But something kept me there, a knot in the gut, like I hadn't yet finished something I didn't even mean to begin. So I walked back to the jailhouse. It sat at the edge of town, past the tannery, where the air always smelled like rot. A low stone building, moss growing between the bricks, a rusted door set crooked on its hinges. No guards outside. Just a woman sweeping the dirt near the entrance, who didn't look up when I passed. Inside, the air was thick. It clung to the throat. I asked to see him. The man behind the desk, large, balding, wiping ink from his fingers, raised an eyebrow. He won't be much company. I don't need company, I said. He didn't argue. Just waved me through. The cell was small. Bare stone walls. A single wooden bench. And there he was, Elias, lying on his side, wrapped in that same blanket, now stained darker near the chest. His eyes were closed. His breathing shallow. I sat near the door, unsure of what I expected. A moment of clarity? A thank you? An accusation? Instead, there was nothing. Just the slow rhythm of someone not yet gone, but no longer here. And then, without opening his eyes, he spoke. 3 words. I was hungry. His voice was paper-thin, but steady. Not angry. Not pleading. Just a plain truth, left hanging in the space between us. I was hungry. And with those words, something inside me shifted. Not a revelation, not an answer, just the uncomfortable knowing that sometimes the worst things aren't born of cruelty, but of neglect. He didn't speak again. I stayed a while longer, until a guard knocked and told me it was time. I stood, looked back once more, and left without saying anything. There was nothing left to say. The road south felt longer after that. The wind colder. Every village I passed seemed quieter, like I was listening for something no one else could hear. I delivered the letter. Ate. Slept. Continued. But Elias stayed. In my memory. In the silence between tasks. In the moments before sleep, when your thoughts are too soft to fight off what they remember. Sometimes, I wondered what became of him. If the wounds healed. If he ever walked again. If anyone looked him in the eye after that day, or if he simply faded into corners no one wanted to look at. Because that's the part people never talk about. Not the sentence. Not the punishment. But the after. The way a town forgets your name, but remembers your pain. The way children who once played in the square now look down when you pass. The way hunger becomes more than a feeling, it becomes a mark. A shadow. A stain you can't wash off. Years passed. Seasons turned. And still, sometimes, in dreams, I see that pot. I hear the scrape of iron. I smell the fire and the fear. And I remember the crowd, not cruel, not evil, just watching. The worst part wasn't what they did to Elias. The worst part was that everyone stayed to see it.